"Not that one, surely," said Mrs. Averill Bidwell, loud enough for the whole assembly room to hear. "She has neither face nor fortune to recommend her." I was standing near enough to see Alara Fenwick's hand tighten on her lemonade glass until I feared it would crack, and near enough to see her chin lift instead of drop. That was the moment I understood what manner of woman she truly was, though it would be some months yet before the rest of Ashcombe understood it too. I have been vicar of St. Aldhelm's these 19 years, and in that time I have buried the proud and christened the humble and married a great many people who ought, by every rule of sense, never to have suited one another at all. But I never married two people whose beginning I witnessed so entirely, from the first cruel word to the last held breath, as I did Alara Fenwick and the Duke of Thorncastle. I set it down now not to boast of my small part in it, but because Alara asked me to, many years later, over tea in the very drawing-room where she once was told she did not belong. She said the story ought to live somewhere beyond memory. I told her I would try to do it justice. I am an old man now, and my hand is not so steady as it was, but I remember every hour of it as though it were painted on glass. Alara had come to Ashcombe 3 years before that assembly, an orphaned niece taken in by her uncle Bidwell more from duty than affection, and lodged in his household alongside his wife and their 2 handsome daughters, Prudence and Charity, names which I confess I never once heard applied with any accuracy to the young women who bore them. Alara was not beautiful in the way the county measured beauty. She was thin where fashion wanted softness, brown-haired where fashion wanted gold, and she wore always the plainest gowns in any room, made over from her cousin's cast-offs and cut without the least regard for her figure. She had a crooked front tooth she was self-conscious of, and tried, without much success, to hide behind a closed smile. Mrs. Bidwell called her the plain one, so often and so carelessly, that I believe some in the parish had forgotten she had a Christian name at all. But I had sat across from her at 100 parish suppers, and I knew what her aunt did not trouble to learn, that Alara Fenwick read Greek for pleasure, that she had a memory for scripture and poetry that put my own to shame, that she nursed the sick of the parish without being asked and without expecting thanks, and that she possessed a dry, quiet wit that she deployed so subtly most people never noticed they had been gently corrected. I liked her enormously. I do not mind confessing that in a house full of noise and vanity, she was the only Bidwell I ever sought out by choice. The Duke of Thorncastle came into our county that autumn to bury his father, and stayed on, it was said, because he could not bear London and could not yet bear his own echoing halls either. He was called the Marble Duke before I ever laid eyes on him, and I understood the name within a quarter hour of making his acquaintance. He had a face carved for coldness, strong, still, unreadable, and eyes so dark and so guarded that more than one matron in the county declared she had never seen him smile and doubted he was capable of it. He came to church that first Sunday and sat alone in the Thorncastle pew, upright and silent, and left without speaking to a soul. The county buzzed for a week over nothing but the set of his jaw. I will tell you plainly what I thought of him at first. That grief had made a fortress of him, and that fortresses, however grand, are lonely places to live. I did not then guess that the woman who would breach those walls was already sitting 3 pews behind him, folding her hands over a hymnal too worn for a house as fine as her uncle's, mocked that very morning for wearing the same bonnet to church 3 Sundays running. It began, properly, at the Thorncastle stables, though neither of them would have called it a beginning at the time. Alara had gone walking, as was her habit, along the lane that skirted the ducal park, seeking the particular quiet that only open country gives a woman who is never permitted quiet at home. She came upon the Duke's favorite hunter cast in a ditch, tangled in a fallen fence rail, thrashing and bleeding at the fetlock, with no groom in sight and the beast plainly panicking itself toward a broken leg. I have this account from her own lips and later confirmed every particular of it from the groom himself, so I set it down as fact and not embellishment. She did not scream for help, though help was nowhere near. She climbed into the ditch in her plain gray walking dress, spoke low and steady to the animal as I am told her mother had once taught her to do with frightened creatures, and worked the rail free with her own hands, tearing her palms in the process, until the horse could scramble clear. It was in this state, mud to her knees, blood on her gloves, her plain bonnet knocked half off her head, that the Duke found her, having ridden out at a gallop the moment the empty saddle was reported to him. I have heard him describe the sight only once, years later, and he did not describe her mud or her ruined gloves. He said he came around the bend in the lane and saw a woman kneeling in a ditch, entirely unconcerned for herself, murmuring comfort to a horse that did not belong to her, as though it were the most natural thing in the world to give herself entirely to a stranger's suffering. He said that was the first moment in a year of grief that he forgot, for the length of several breaths, that he was grieving at all. He did not gush his gratitude, for gushing was not in his nature. He dismounted, examined the horse's leg with his own hands, and then turned to her and said, with the flat courtesy of a man unused to owing anyone anything, "You have done my Marlowe a kindness I cannot easily repay, madam. You are bleeding." "It is nothing, your grace," said Alara. The horse had the worse of it, and made to leave before he could catch her name, being from long habit disinclined to linger where she was not wanted. But he asked her name outright, in a tone that did not admit of being ignored, and when she gave it, plainly, without simpering, without the practiced curtsy her cousins would have produced, I am told he looked at her a moment longer than courtesy required, as though turning the sound of it over in his mind. Then he thanked her again formally and let her go. She told no one at home. I only learned of it because she told me, some days later, over the excuse of a delivered basket of preserves, and even then she made light of it, as she made light of most things that touched her too closely to discuss plainly. "He looked at me as though I were a curiosity, Mr. Trent," she said, "a woman who does not know her place. I dare say he has forgotten my face already." I did not think it wise, then, to tell her that I doubted very much a man forgot the face of a woman who had knelt in a ditch for his horse, while the rest of the county could not be troubled to learn her Christian name. I was wrong about a great many things in this story, but I was not wrong about that. The Duke came to call at the Bidwell house not 1 week later, ostensibly upon Mr. Bidwell, upon some matter of parish drainage that any sensible man could see was invented for the occasion, for the Duke of Thorncastle had never once in his life concerned himself with drainage. Mrs. Bidwell was thrown into transports of preparation the moment his card arrived. I happened to be present that afternoon, having come to discuss the church roof with Mr. Bidwell, and so I witnessed the whole business with my own eyes. Prudence and Charity were arrayed like a pair of matched pheasants, all curls and ribbon, and stationed in the drawing-room's best light. Alara was told, in front of me and without the least softening, that she might pour the tea and then remove herself, as her aunt saw no reason to inflict her appearance upon a duke's afternoon. I watched Alara's face when her aunt said this. She did not flinch. She had, I think, long since taught herself not to flinch at such things, which struck me even then as a harder discipline than not being wounded at all. The Duke arrived, was seated, endured Mrs. Bidwell's transparent maneuvering and her daughter's competing recitations of accomplishments neither possessed in any great degree, and answered every question put to him with the same courteous, marble stillness the county had already learned to expect of him. I watched his eyes, however, and I will swear before any bench in England that they moved to the door each time it opened, and dimmed, very slightly, each time it was not who he was watching for. It was Alara who brought in the second pot of tea, as the maid had been sent on some other errand, and it was Alara who, setting his cup before him, murmured, "I hope Marlowe's leg is healing, your grace," in a voice pitched only for him. I saw something move behind that marble stillness. It was not a smile. I do not think I saw the man smile outright until much later in this story, but it was a loosening, a warmth surfacing briefly through ice, gone almost as soon as it appeared. "He mends well, Miss Fenwick," he said, "thanks to a steadier hand than my groom's." Mrs. Bidwell, catching only the exchange of names and none of its history, laughed a shade too brightly and said, "Oh, Ilara is forever tending some creature or other, your grace. It is quite her only talent," and steered the conversation firmly back toward her daughter's talent for the pianoforte. Ilara withdrew as she had been bidden, but I saw the Duke's gaze follow her from the room, and I saw it return to the door twice more before he took his leave, as though hoping she might reappear. He called again the following fortnight, and the fortnight after that, always with some thin pretext, and always, I began to notice, for I made a habit by then of being present when I could, partly from affection for Ilara and partly, I confess, from an old man's curiosity, always finding some moment, however brief, to exchange a few words with the niece nobody wished him to notice. He asked her opinion of a book he had seen her reading. He asked what she thought of the new bridge proposed for the Millstream, a question that startled her into an answer of such sense and clarity that even Mrs. Bidwell blinked. He was, I began slowly to understand, not a cold man at all, but a careful one, starved so long of anyone who spoke to him plainly rather than performing for his title that he did not yet know how to reach for what he wanted without first testing whether it was real. There was a parish supper that November, held in the long room behind the church to raise funds for the winter poor, a modest gathering of tenant farmers and tradesmen's families that no Duke had ever troubled to attend in all my 19 years at St. Aldhelm's. The Duke came anyway, unannounced, and I watched Mrs. Bidwell nearly drop the ladle from her hand at the sight of him ducking beneath our low doorway in his fine dark coat, entirely out of place among the trestle tables and the mismatched crockery, and yet somehow, within the hour, entirely at his ease. He had come, he told me quietly, because he had heard Miss Fenwick was to read aloud that evening, a small tradition of ours in which some volunteer read a passage of scripture or poetry to close the supper before the singing began. Ilara read that night from the Book of Ruth, her voice low and clear over the crowded room, and I watched the Duke's face as she spoke the old words about a woman who followed where she was not required to follow, who gleaned in another's field and was not ashamed of the gleaning. He did not take his eyes from her for the whole of it. When she had finished and the room had returned to its clatter and its singing, he found a moment to stand beside her near the door, away from the crush, and I own I permitted myself to linger near enough to hear, for I had by then given up all pretense of impartiality in the matter. "You read that passage as though you understood her," he said. "I have gleaned in a great many fields that were not mine, your grace," Ilara answered, with the dry humor that so rarely showed itself before strangers, though I confess none of them belonged to so attentive a beaux. He laughed a short, startled sound, as though laughter itself were a muscle gone unused, and for a moment neither of them said anything further, only stood together in the noise and the candlelight of that humble room, and I thought, watching them, that I had never seen two people look so entirely comfortable in a silence, which is, in my long experience of courtship, a surer sign of a match than any amount of clever talk. Mrs. Bidwell called Ilara away before either of them could say more, but I saw the Duke watch her go with an expression that told me plainly he had already decided something in his own mind, whatever caution still held his tongue. Ilara, for her part, guarded her heart as fiercely as she guarded her composure. "He is a duke, Mr. Trent," she said to me once, on one of our long walks to visit an ailing widow at the edge of the parish, "and I am a poor relation kept for the use of her needle and her patience. Whatever kindness passes between us is only the kindness a man shows a stray dog that once did him a good turn. I will not make a fool of myself imagining otherwise." I told her I thought she undervalued herself, and she laughed, not bitterly, for bitterness was not in her nature either, but with the particular weariness of a woman who had been told her value 100 times by people with every reason to lie about it, and had learned to trust none of them. I did not press the point that day. I wish now that I had pressed it harder, for she carried that weariness like a stone in her pocket clear through to the night I am about to describe, and it cost her dearly before it was done. The cruelty came to its full height at the harvest ball given by Lord Averil Combe, the largest gathering the county produced outside of the Thorncastle house itself, and the occasion, as it happened, upon which the Duke had let it quietly be known, he intended to announce his selection of a bride, having endured a full season of the county parading its daughters before him, and having grown, by every account, thoroughly tired of the exercise. The whole county understood this to mean Prudence Bidwell, or possibly her cousin Miss Averil Combe, for the Duke had danced twice with each of them at separate gatherings, and idle tongues make certainties out of far less. Mrs. Bidwell was in such a fever of anticipation that she spent above her means on Prudence's gown, a confection of rose silk that took 3 seamstresses a fortnight to complete, and gave not a thought to what Alara might wear until the very afternoon of the ball, when she tossed her a gown 2 seasons out of fashion, let out clumsily at the seams, and told her she supposed it would do, since no one of consequence would be looking at her regardless. I arrived at Combe House that evening in my own plain black coat, feeling rather like a crow among peacocks as I always did at such gatherings, and I found Alara standing near the refreshment table in that ill-fitting gown, her hair dressed simply, wearing no jewels at all beside her cousin's borrowed pearls and diamonds. She looked, if I am honest, exactly as her aunt intended her to look, unremarkable, unfinished, a woman easily overlooked in a room built for glitter. It was there that Mrs. Bidwell made her remark about Alara having neither face nor fortune to recommend her, not troubling to lower her voice, believing herself among sympathetic company. Several of the younger ladies nearby laughed. Prudence, glowing in her rose silk, added something crueler still. I will not set down the exact words, for they do her no credit, and Alara herself asked me years later never to repeat them. But the substance was that Alara ought to be grateful to attend the ball at all, given what she was, and ought not to expect any gentleman present to trouble himself over her. I watched Alara's face. Her chin came up, as it had in the assembly room those months before, and she said nothing at all in her own defense, only turned and walked toward the terrace doors as though she required air, with a composure that must have cost her every reserve of will she possessed. I followed, meaning to offer what comfort an old vicar can offer, and found her standing at the balustrade looking out over the dark garden, her hands gripping the stone rail hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "They are not wrong, Mr. Trent," she said before I could speak. "I have no fortune, I have no beauty the county recognizes. I ought not to mind so much what is only the truth spoken aloud." "The truth," I said, "is that you have more sense and more kindness in your smallest finger than the rest of that ballroom possesses altogether, and any man worth the name would see it in a quarter hour if he troubled to look past a rose silk gown." I do not know that I comforted her greatly, but she pressed my hand and thanked me, and after a moment straightened her shoulders and said she would not give her aunt the satisfaction of hiding for the whole evening, and went back inside with her head high, though I saw her eyes were bright with the tears she refused to let fall. I did not know, as I watched her go, that the Duke of Thorncastle had come out onto that terrace by the side door not 2 minutes before, seeking the same solitude the crowded ballroom denied him, and had heard every word that passed between Mrs. Bidwell's party and Alara inside, through the open terrace doors, before I ever arrived. He told me this himself much later, when the whole matter was long since settled, and he could speak of it with something almost like humor, though there had been no humor in him that night. He said he stood in the shadow of the ivy unseen, and felt something in his chest go entirely still with fury, not loud fury, for he did not possess loud fury, but the cold, absolute kind that a man who has spent his whole life governing his temper turns instead into resolve. He did not come forward that night. I have asked him why since, and he told me he did not trust himself to speak calmly, and a duke's temper displayed in a stranger's ballroom would only have made Alara's evening worse, not better. So he withdrew, and watched from across the room as she returned inside with her composure rebuilt, and he asked her to dance. I saw this part myself, and I have never in 19 years of watching human folly and human grace seen a room go so silent so fast. The Duke of Thorncastle, whom the whole county had watched for a season deciding between the daughters of its finest families, crossed the floor of Coombe House directly past Prudence Bidwell, past Miss Averil Coombe, past a dozen hopeful mothers holding their breath, and stopped before Alara Fenwick in her ill-fitting, twice-sterned gown and bowed, and asked for the next dance. She stared at him. I do not blame her. I confess I stared myself. "Your Grace," she said low, "I think you mistake me for my cousin." "I do not," he said. "I have never in my life mistaken you for anyone, Miss Fenwick. Will you dance with me?" She danced with him. I will not pretend I recall every step of it, for I am no judge of dancing, but I recall that the room did not resume its noise for the whole of it, that every eye followed them, and that Mrs. Bidwell's face went the color of curdled cream. I recall that Alara, for the first 2 turns of the floor, held herself as stiff as a woman braced for a blow, plainly certain some humiliation must be coming, that he meant it as a jest, or an act of pity, or a test she would fail. And I recall the exact moment I saw her understand it was neither. Some words he spoke to her, too low for any of the rest of us to hear, made her lift her face to his in open astonishment, and then, for the first time that whole cruel evening, smile without hiding her crooked tooth behind her hand. It was not, however, the end of the trial for her, but rather its true beginning, for a single dance, however extraordinary, could still be dismissed by unkind tongues as a passing whim, a duke's odd charity, and the county set about dismissing it with great enthusiasm in the weeks that followed. Mrs. Bidwell, stung and frightened in equal measure, redoubled her efforts to put Prudence in the duke's path, and redoubled, too, her cruelty toward Alara at home, as though she might shame her niece back into invisibility before the damage to the family's ambitions became permanent. I will not recount every unkindness of that autumn. It would tire the reader as it tired my own patience at the time to hear of them. I will say only that Alara was given the coldest room in the house, the most worn of the family's linens, and was made, more than once, to eat apart from the family when guests of consequence called, lest her plainness embarrass the household. Through it all she bore herself with a dignity that shamed her tormentors more than any retort could have, though I do not think they were capable of feeling shame, being too well practiced at cruelty to recognize it in themselves. The Duke, meanwhile, called with a frequency that could no longer be mistaken for chance. He rode past the Bidwell house so often on invented errands that even the stable boys began to wager on which day he would appear. He sent, once, a small case of books on husbandry and horsemanship addressed plainly to Miss Fenwick, with no note beyond his card, having remembered, from some idle remark she had made months before about wishing to understand more of how her uncle's tenant farms were managed, a passing interest she herself had half forgotten voicing. Mrs. Bidwell wished to intercept the parcel and claim it for Prudence, but the Duke's own coachman had been instructed to deliver it into Alara's hands directly, and so, for once, her aunt's schemes were thwarted by simple ducal thoroughness. I sat with Alara one afternoon that autumn, in the small garden behind the church where she often came to escape her aunt's house, and she confessed to me, haltingly, that she had begun to hope, and that the hoping frightened her more than any cruelty her aunt had yet devised. "If I let myself believe it, Mr. Trent, and I am wrong, I do not think I shall recover from it as I have recovered from the rest," she said. "It is easier to be thought plain by people who have always thought me plain. It would be a different sort of wound entirely to be thought worthy by a duke, and then proven otherwise." I told her what I believed to be true, which was that a man such as the Duke of Thorncastle, who had spent a full season resisting the county's most determined matchmaking, and had never once, in my observation, paid a compliment he did not mean, was not a man given to trifling. He does not know how to want carelessly, I said. I do not think he has begun this without meaning to finish it. She did not answer, but she held my hand a moment longer than was her habit before we parted, and I saw in her face both the hope and the fear sitting side by side, as they had sat in her, I think, for the whole of her life. The Duke himself came to me not long after, in the vestry after a Sunday service, and asked, with more hesitation than I had yet seen him display over any matter, whether I thought Miss Fenwick's family treated her with the consideration due her. I told him plainly what I had witnessed over 3 years, holding nothing back, for I judged he deserved the truth and Alara deserved an advocate who was not afraid to give it. His face, as I spoke, went through no dramatic transformation. He was not a man for dramatic transformations, but something in his stillness hardened into a decision, and when I had finished he thanked me gravely and said only, "That will not continue much longer, Mr. Trent, I promise you." I did not then know precisely what he intended, but I felt, for the first time, entirely easy about the outcome of the matter, whatever form it took. What he intended, it transpired, was to make his choice before the whole of the county at once, in a setting too public and too final for anyone to mistake, dismiss, or unravel afterward. And so he settled upon his own long-postponed ball at Thorncastle itself, the grand entertainment the house had not seen since his father's day, to which the whole county was bidden, and at which, it was universally understood, he would at last announce his intended bride. The night came clear and cold, with a hard, bright moon over the park, and Thorncastle's great hall was lit end to end with candles until the whole room seemed to glow from within, the chandeliers throwing their light down upon silk and jewels and the polished floor until it was, I have always thought since, very like standing inside a lit lantern. I arrived early, as was my habit, and found the household in a state of ordered splendor, the Duke himself moving among his own guests with a composure that I alone, perhaps, understood to be concealing an unbearable tension. Alara arrived with the Bidwells, and I confess my heart ached at the sight of her, for her aunt had once again seen to it that she was the plainest ornament in a glittering room, a gown of gray wool, sensible and unadorned, beside her cousin's silk and pearls, as though Mrs. Bidwell meant, on this night above all nights, to ensure her niece vanished entirely into the background. Alara wore it, as she wore every indignity, without complaint, but I saw her eyes move once briefly, toward the great curved stair where the Duke stood receiving his guests, and saw the fear in them, the old fear that hoping was a fool's game she had played too long already. The evening wore on with dancing and supper, and the usual glittering noise of such occasions, and I watched Mrs. Bidwell grow steadily more agitated as the hour approached when everyone understood the Duke's announcement must come, for Prudence had been primped and positioned all evening with the desperate hope her mother had never entirely surrendered. I watched Alara retreat, as she so often did at such gatherings, toward the edges of the room, near a bank of candles by the long windows, as though she might make herself small enough to escape notice. And I saw, too, the particular cruelty of that instinct in her, that a woman who had done nothing all her life but earn love through quiet goodness should still believe, on the very threshold of being chosen, that the safest place for her was the shadow. It was there that Mrs. Bidwell found her, and I was near enough once again to hear what passed, for I had drifted toward that same quiet corner myself, sensing some crisis in the offing. "You will not stand near the dancing tonight, Alara," her aunt hissed, low and vicious. "You will not embarrass this family further by putting yourself forward where his grace might feel obliged to notice you out of pity. Stand here and stay here, and do not imagine for one moment that whatever foolishness he showed you at Coombe House was anything more than a Duke's passing amusement with a woman beneath his notice." Prudence, drawn by her mother's tone, added her own contribution, cold and clear enough that several nearby guests turned to look. "Everyone knows he means to choose me tonight, Alara. Do try not to make a spectacle of your disappointment when he does." I saw Ilara's composure, held so long and so valiantly, come very near to breaking at last, not into tears, for she did not weep, but into something worse, a kind of quiet surrender, a lowering of her eyes and her chin both, as though she had decided in that moment to believe them, to fold the small bright hope she had carried all autumn back into the plain gray nothing her aunt had always told her she was. And it was at precisely that moment, with half the county's eyes drifting toward the little tableau in the corner, that the music stopped. I have attended a great many balls in my long life, and I have never before or since heard a room fall silent so completely, and so suddenly, as Thorncastle's great hall fell silent then. For the Duke had raised his hand to the musicians and crossed the floor, not toward Prudence Bidwell, glowing and expectant beside the punch table, not toward Miss Averil Combe, who had worn her finest sapphires for precisely this hour, but straight across the length of that vast candle-lit room, past every powdered and bejeweled guest present, to the shadowed corner by the long windows where Ilara Fenwick stood in her plain gray wool with her aunt's cruelty still ringing in her ears. He stopped before her. He did not speak first to Mrs. Bidwell, did not acknowledge Prudence's stricken face, did not so much as glance at the sea of astonished guests now craning to see. He looked only at Ilara, and I saw in the candlelight that the marble stillness the whole county had named him for was entirely gone from his face, replaced by something so open and so unguarded that I heard more than one lady near me gasp aloud at the sight of it, for none of them had ever seen the Duke of Thorncastle look at anything the way he looked at her in that moment. "Miss Fenwick," he said, and his voice, though quiet, carried to every corner of that silent hall, "I have spent a season watching this county look past you, and I confess I do not understand it, for I have never in my life met a woman of such courage, such honesty, and such goodness as you possess, and I have looked for nothing else since the day I found you kneeling in a ditch, ruining your gloves for a horse that was not yours to save. I did not come here tonight to choose a bride from among the finest gowns in this room. I came to ask the one woman in it who has never once asked anything of me, who has been told by everyone she loves that she is not worth choosing, whether she will do me the honor of becoming my wife, not out of pity, which I think you fear, and not out of a passing fancy, which I think you have been taught to expect of men, but because I have never wanted anything in my life as plainly and as entirely as I want you beside me for the whole of it." He held out his hand. "I have stood at a great many altars and witnessed a great many vows, but I have never seen a silence like the one that held Thorncastle's ballroom in that instant, a silence in which I could hear, quite distinctly, the small catch of breath that went through Ilara Fenwick before she moved at all." She looked at his extended hand, and then at his face, searching it, I think, for the joke, the pity, the trick that 3 years of her aunt's teaching had told her must be hiding somewhere in any kindness offered her. She found none. I saw the exact moment she stopped searching and simply believed him, for her whole face changed, the guarded weariness dropping away all at once, and she placed her hand in his. "Your Grace," she said, and her voice shook only a little, "I have neither fortune nor beauty the county recognizes, as I have been reminded most recently not a quarter hour ago. I would not have you regret this before witnesses." "Then let the witnesses hear me say," said the Duke, and here, for the first time in the whole of my long acquaintance with him, I saw him smile, not the small loosening I had glimpsed once or twice before, but a full, unguarded smile that transformed his carved marble face into something almost boyish with relief and joy. "That I have never regretted anything less in my life, and that any man who cannot see your worth, Ilara Fenwick, has no eyes worth the having. You are the most beautiful woman in this room, and you have been so every time I have looked at you, and I mean to spend the rest of my days making certain you never doubt it again." He raised her hand and pressed his lips to it, there before the whole assembled county, and I will confess that my own eyes were not dry, old fool that I am. I looked then toward Mrs. Bidwell, and I will not pretend to any great charity in reporting that the sight of her face, white, slack-jawed, robbed entirely of the words that had come so easily to her cruelty all these years, gave me a satisfaction I have since had to confess and do penance for, though I do not think heaven begrudged me the feeling overmuch. Prudence stood frozen beside the punch table, her sapphire-draped cousin equally stricken, and around them the whole glittering room had turned, as one body, to stare at the woman they had spent a season overlooking, now standing in the full candlelight of the Duke's regard with her chin lifted and her crooked-toothed smile, for once, entirely unhidden. It was Ilara herself who broke what remained of the silence, for she was never a woman to leave a debt unspoken, however painful. She turned, still holding the Duke's hand, and looked at her aunt across the room, and said, in a voice that held no triumph and no bitterness, only a kind of quiet, hard-won peace, "I have been told most of my life, aunt, that I was not worth the looking. I do not say this to wound you, only because it is true, and because I think it right that it be said once plainly before I stop carrying it. I forgive you the saying of it, but I will not carry it any further than tonight." Mrs. Bidwell said nothing at all in reply, which I believe was the first wise thing I had ever known her to do. The musicians, at some unseen signal, began to play again softly, and the Duke drew Ilara out onto the floor before the whole recovering, murmuring, astonished room, and danced with her precisely as he had danced with her at Coombe House months before, save that this time there was no need for either of them to guard their faces, no cruelty waiting in the wings to be endured afterward, only the candlelight and the music and the two of them turning slowly together, while the county that had dismissed her watched, and understood at last exactly what it had failed all along to see. I will tell the rest briefly, for it is the part every reader of such histories expects, and I will not withhold it. They were married that spring at St. Aldhelm's, by my own hand, with the whole county in attendance, including, I might note, Mrs. Bidwell and her daughters, invited by Ilara's own generous insistence over her new husband's mild objection, for she said she would not begin her marriage by nursing old wounds when she had spent so long learning to set them down. I stood at that same altar where I had watched her sit through so many indifferent Sundays in her worn bonnet, and I confess my voice was not quite steady when I asked whether any man knew just cause why they should not be joined, for I do not think any room ever held a silence so entirely without objection, nor a bride whose joy sat so plainly and so rightfully upon her face. The Duke settled a portion on his new wife entirely independent of his own estate, so that she should never again, he told me privately, be made to feel she owed her comfort to anyone's charity, and I have watched, in the years since, a marriage built not on the glitter of that first extraordinary evening, but on the steadier, quieter devotion that followed it, a man who consults his wife on every matter of the estate and the tenant farm she once wished to understand, and a woman who has become, by every account in the county, the most beloved Mistress Thorncastle has known in living memory, sought out by the very families who once would not trouble to learn her name. She established, within her first year as Duchess, a small school for the tenant children of the estate, and taught there herself 2 mornings a week for as long as her health allowed it, saying she remembered too well what it was to be thought beneath the trouble of teaching. I visited them at Thorncastle only last winter, an old man now slower on his feet than he once was, and found the Duke, still called the Marble Duke by strangers who judge only by his face in repose, though no one who has seen him watch his wife enter a room could believe the name any longer, sitting beside Ilara at the fire with their youngest daughter asleep against his shoulder. And I thought, watching them, of that ditch, and that ballroom, and all the small cruelties in between. And how strange and how right it is that the world so often saves its greatest gifts for those who have been taught longest to expect none. Ilara caught my eye across the fire and smiled, the old crooked smile she no longer troubles to hide from anyone, and said, "You were there for all of it, Mr. Trent. You must tell it truly when you tell it. I have tried to, and if I have succeeded at nothing else in this account, I hope I have made plain the one thing I know to be true beyond all doubting, that he loved her before the county ever saw it, and loves her now exactly as he did in that first astonished silence, entirely, and without reservation, as a man loves the one thing in his life he very nearly let go unclaimed. There is one more thing I have never told, and Alara has given me leave to close with it, since it explains, better than anything I have written, the manner of man she chose to spend her life beside. Some years after their marriage, when Prudence Bidwell had fallen upon leaner times through her own husband's poor management, it was the Duke himself, not Alara, who quietly arranged the settlement of a small parish living for the family, refusing all thanks, and instructing his steward to say only, if asked, that it was done at her Grace's request. When I mentioned to him once gently that Alara had made no such request, he told me he knew it perfectly well. She would never ask it for herself, he said, and she is too generous not to have wished it had she thought of it. I have simply learned to do her wishing before she need voice it. That, I think, is the whole of what I have to tell of the Marble Duke and the woman the county called Plain, that he was never marble at all beneath the stillness, only a man waiting, with more patience than the rest of us could summon, for someone worth breaking the stone for. He found her in a ditch in a gray walking dress, and he chose her again in silk and candlelight, before the whole shocked assembly of a county that had never once thought to look twice at her. And he has been choosing her, quietly, every day since, in 100 small kindnesses no ballroom will ever witness, which is, Alara tells me, the truer romance of the two.